As a believer, we don't own anything. We are servants and slaves of the God Most High. He has purchased us. He has everything that is ours. In our commitment to Christ, we gladly just say, Lord, teach us and show us how to manage what you've given us. You have overwhelmed us with blessing. None of it's ours at all. It brings us to our second point, stewardship, not ownership. Got to keep our mindset in check. Stewardship, not ownership. What's another word for stewardship? If you're a steward, you're a what? A good manager. Jot that down. It's a manager. We don't use steward or stewardship outside of the church very often. Steward is a manager, which is not the same as the owner. Now, last week, this is interesting, we asked you to be an owner of God's purposes in ministry. This week we're saying, instead of owning our possessions, we should own the ministry and give ourselves to the ministry. You see, friends, when it comes to ownership and management, track with me here. I want you to capture this. I believe so often we tend to grasp what God calls us to manage, and we tend to manage, we'll see what happens with it, what God calls us to grasp. He calls every believer to grasp the ministry of disciple making, the ministry of evangelism, the ministry of the local church. He calls every believer to grasp his purposes that glorify Jesus Christ in relationships and in the ministry going forward. Grasp the ministry of his glory being promoted to the corners of the world. And he tells us, do not grasp your possessions. Manage your possessions. Steward your possessions. Recognize that when you grasp that which I've given you to manage, you have committed fraud. Now, let me give you an illustration to unlock this for you. Randy Alcorn says that we are God's money managers. I would imagine that many of the families here in this auditorium have someone that manages your financial accounts. Many families do. Those are money managers. Imagine that you have an appointment with this money manager, and you go to his office, and you arrive there before he does, and he rolls in with this wildly expensive car, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're like, wow. You hear the rumble or whatever, the engine rolling in, and you're sitting there thinking, wow. And he comes through the door. You haven't seen him in some time. He's wearing this flashy suit, and you're like, wow, I don't know much about suits, but you look like you spent a lot on that. And you plunk down to have your appointment, and he's telling you about his vacations that he's spending and wild adventures all over the planet. And you're like, that's enormous. Like, that's a tremendous amount of money. So you finally get to your accounts, and he turns around and says, sorry, not the best news about your accounts. It's approaching zero at this point. Where did all that money go to? Anyone? Yeah, it went to his adventures. The money manager took your money that you own and used it on whom? Themselves. Is that cool? Not at all. That's illegal. And you would call the cops. He would go to jail. Do we do that to God's money? It's his money. And David's impulse here in verses 14 and 16, he repeats himself, for all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. Verse 14. Verse 16, it says, these come from your hand, and all is your own. So, all that we have, money, resources, time, talents, ability, care, love, passion, all that we have is his. He owns it. We're just the money manager. And for us to take what's not ours from that and make it our own for our possessions and our adventures constitutes a form of spiritual fraud. So we need to be what? Stewards, managers, not owners. Not owners. About 28 years ago, my dad took my sister and I on a trip to Brazil. When I was a child, I lived there, and he wanted to bring us back to where we lived in Rio de Janeiro and just have a few weeks of vacation. It was an amazing trip that I'll never forget. It included time in the Amazon, worst sunburn of my life. We visited a witch doctor. Yeah, all right. And it's a true story. It's wild. And so we had these different stages of our vacation. And the first one was in the interior of Brazil in a place called Chapada dos Guimarães. And it's basically wilderness. And so my dad has a friend named Mario, a Brazilian friend named Mario, and he took us on this adventure in this area that he knows very well. So it was my sister, my dad, and Mario. And we spent several days on a bunch of adventures. It was really quite wild. Well, as we were leaving that portion of the trip and transitioning back to civilization, we stopped for an afternoon at his house. You see, Mario and my dad were old-time friends, and Mario wanted to grab some old friends together and basically have a party. And so just a simple afternoon party. It was churrascaria is what it would be called in Portuguese. So we're having this party, and we're at his house now with his family. We met his wife and his 3-year-old child, and they were friends, and we were just having a nice meal and enjoying an afternoon together until this 3-year-old turned into a menace. Well, in fact, he turned into a little tyrant, to be honest, and he paraded about the house repeating, I can hear it to this day, é meu, é meu. É meu in English means it's mine. And so this is how this would work. You would be sitting there innocently with your plate of brilliantly barbecued Brazilian meat and your drink, and he would walk up to your plate and take from it whatever he wanted. He would look you dead in the eyes and go, é meu, and walk off. You're like, well, it's not yours, but I was going to eat it, but now I won't. I'll get more, whatever the case was. And then he would do it to your drink, and he would just go around the house at will, claiming whatever he wanted as his own, and marching around like the little tyrant that he thought that he was. Well, maybe we're closer to that young boy in our hearts than we want to acknowledge. You see, we need to continue to cultivate the mindset of a steward. We need to remind ourselves that we don't own, as a believer, we don't own anything. We are servants and slaves of the God Most High. He has purchased us. He has everything that is ours. In our commitment to Christ, we gladly just say, Lord, teach us and show us how to manage what you've given us. You have overwhelmed us with blessing. None of it's ours at all. Teach us the heart of a manager, a worshipful manager, and cultivate this mindset. Help us to maintain this mindset of a manager of all of your resources.